At the very start of the Neo Egoist League, Yoichi Isagi gets a rude awakening about how woefully unprepared he is for the world of professionals. He's confronted by the reality that he can't even imagine himself reaching the top. Very specifically, that he can't visualize an ideal to put him on par with the current number one. Yet, if you think about it, there's something odd about presenting Isagi's inability to visualize himself as the world's best as his Achilles heel. After all, our protagonist has distinguished himself by his exceptional perceptive faculties since the earliest parts of the story. So in that light, there is a completely different interpretation of this scene that flips Noah's criticisms on their heads. If the greatest detriment to a player's success is a lack of vision, Noah's programmatic statement actually reveals the very reason why Isagi has the makings of a champion. So, in this meeting, the seed has been planted for the overarching concept of the entire Neo Egoist League. This is the arc about the power of sight, imagination, and appearances, and it's a story of how Yoichi Isagi attains the vision of the world's best striker. Hello, my name is Sean, and this video has been in the making for over a year by this point, so it's honestly surreal that it's finally finished. Also, if you like what I do and want to support the channel, do consider signing up to my Patreon. You'll get access to my weekly podcast where I discuss the new Blue Lock chapters and also help me cover channel-related expenses such as artwork. Now, you might be saying that Blue Lock has always given sight pride of place, that this is by no means unique to the NEL. After all, it's always been a story where the protagonist's superpower is literally his ability to make better use of his eyes than those around him. Yet, what I want to show in this analysis is that the NEL takes this concept and blows it up to an all-encompassing metaphor. And more than that this is the point where Isagi's exceptional vision is transformed from just one tool in one's arsenal to the narrative justification for his eventual rise to the top. To start with, let's talk about the setting of the Neo Egoist League itself. The NEL is by far the most voyeuristic section of the story to date. Significantly, its first match ends by unveiling that what was initially presented as a simple training program is in actuality a full-blown reality show, with the Blue Lock candidates' every waking moment under constant surveillance. And more than that, their careers are no longer in the hands of Blue Lock's mastermind. Rather, our hapless teenagers are at the complete mercy of these Big Brother-like football oligarchs who scrutinize their every move from afar. In the NEL, vision is power. The viewer pulls the strings, the viewed are appraised like cattle. And talking about surveillance, I don't think the white spherical design of the cameras in the Blue Lock facility is a coincidence either. They're like massive eyeballs hovering in the air, an ever-present reminder that the Blue Lock candidates are being watched. In fact, they bear an eerie resemblance to the Metavision eye, the inscrutable god gazing at the playing field from a foreign dimension. Throughout the NEL, eyes are presented as omnipotent entities, as symbols of control and dominance. So, let's segue into the matches themselves, and how the idea of viewing is intricately woven into every stage of the narrative. I've already touched on how the meeting with Noah establishes that the NEL will be about Isagi rationally envisioning an ideal to make himself the world's best. At the same time, Ego also establishes at the start of the arc that the key concept to reaching the top in this new environment is proof of true originality. That brings me to the Barcha match, where we are given the first glimpses of the pathway to actualize both of these targets. For this, I need to say a little something about the connotations of the terms in the Japanese. The term that's translated as visualize in the official English version comes from the verb egaku, which means to draw or to paint. From there, by extension, it's also used in the sense of to imagine, as in to picture something in your mind. Secondly, here's something I discuss in greater detail in my video about what gets lost in translation: the term originality. In Japanese, the English loanword is accompanied by two sets of kanji that read self and creativity respectively. So in other words, originality is one's own creativity. From this perspective, it's no coincidence that the first opposing team is represented by a fathomless creative drive. In particular, let's look at Lavinia's speech in light of what has been set up by the arc. If Noa pointed out what Isagi was lacking, 2 chapters later, Lavinia is the first in the story to provide concrete guidance on how to attain this vision of the world's best. Specifically, Lavinia speaks about creating your own unique image of the world's best and showing it to the world through your football as the starting point for your true originality. You copy from others, make it your own, and then train to bring your imagination into reality. In other words, Noa tells Isagi that he needs to paint a mental image of his ideal, and that is exactly what Lavinia subsequently teaches. So, let's look at how Barcha then actualizes the lessons he absorbed from his Spanish master. His new dribbling style sucks his opponents into his visualization. It makes them see the world according to his own image of himself as the world's best. To put it differently, Lavinia teaches that the world of football is filled with competing images and that the greatest striker is the one who imposes their vision upon the world at large. That is also why Barcha is the first of the Blue Lock candidates to seriously contend for the title of World's Best. Barcha is the series' embodiment of the power of imagination, to the point that he was once a prisoner of his own fantasies. And so, there could be no better point of contrast at this point of the story. Isagi, on the one hand, is unable to envision a way for himself to make a difference on the pitch, while Barcha's boundless imagination forces others to see the world in his image. The difference between Isagi and Barcha is exacerbated even further when our protagonist enters the field. At this moment, we get a highly significant flashback to Isagi as a child, watching his idol on the television. This feeds directly into his response to playing with Noa. He sees it first and foremost as the realization of his childhood dream, not as a chance to make a name for himself. Just look at the way Isagi acts when he sees Noa in action. He isn't behaving as a participant in the match, but as a passive viewer, no different from the child staring at the screen all those years ago. Looking at the Barcha match through the arc's central metaphor, the difference couldn't be starker. Where Barcha forces others into his own visualizations, Isagi's adoration of Noa reduces him to a mere spectator, one who can't even imagine plays that surpass Noa's at that. So, let me put this in slightly different terms. The Barcha match posits that dominating the field equals being looked at by other people, and at risk of beating a dead horse, it's no coincidence that this is where we get the reveal of Blue Lock TV and the bidding system. In a match that revolves around having people look at you, the true winner is the one who captures the viewer's attention. And interestingly enough, Noa himself perpetuates this dynamic as well with his proteges. After subbing Kunigami back in, he asks the wildcard survivor if he's watched enough of his movements to copy them. This is how Noa perceives the Blue Lock candidates, as a derivative reflection of himself whose only value can be actualized insofar as he imitates the original. Again, the dynamic is one where the Blue Locker is reduced to a spectator, forever in the shadow of the number 1. That brings me to the finale of the match, the moment of desperation where Isagi has to prove his value. I love this cinematic layout of the page where the camera zooms in further and further towards Isagi's eye as the gateway into the flow states. And given that he can't see a goal for himself yet at this point, he decides to show his value by assisting his teammate. Specifically, because he's aware of the hidden potential in Kunigami that nobody else is seeing. In a match where all the main actors are striving to make themselves the center of attention, including Isagi himself at first, our protagonist eventually comes out on top by looking beyond himself. That's a pattern, by the way, that we'll see time and again throughout the arc, and it's a critical aspect of what makes Isagi Blue Lock's beaten heart. With that, we can turn to Bastard München's second outing against Manshine City. Now, the Manshine match features by far the most overt use of sight as an underlying metaphor in the series, and I've talked about this in extensive detail in my dedicated match analysis. So, for long-time viewers, I will be retreading a bit of familiar ground here, but with more focus on how the Manshine match fits into the ideas of the NEL as a whole. The central conflict of the Manshine match is the disagreement between Isagi, who made an assist as a stepping stone, and Kenya Yukimiya, who is unveiled as an uncompromising idealist. Yukimiya is a very interesting figure in an arc about the power of sight, given that he's afflicted with an eyesight condition that threatens to make him go blind. There's therefore more than a touch of irony in Isagi telling Yukimiya that he's not seeing reality. After all, his teammate is blindsided in more ways than one. However, Yukimiya is far from the only one whose vision is failing him at this moment. In the immediate aftermath of their falling out, Isagi admits that Yukimiya was right in his critique that the past was a serious concession. In Isagi's own assessment, he also suffers from a figurative blindness. He can't even imagine himself surpassing Noah, let alone rationally articulate how to do that. So that brings me to a third figure whose vision is lacking at the start of the match. When Manshine's master Chris Prince presses Seishiro Nagi on how he sees himself attaining his ideal of beating Isagi, Nagi's imagination falls completely short. Not unlike Isagi at this point in the story, mind you. This is reflected as the match unfolds as well. Nagi failed to score with his first shot because he acted before visualizing the play. As the match progresses, however, each of the three central figures of the Manshine match to be precise, has an eye-opening experience. Let me start with Isagi here, because this is arguably the most important moment in the entire NEL. Isagi spends a significant amount of the early parts of the match gazing at Kaiza. Not out of admiration or because he's stuck in his rival's visualization, but so that he can learn and improve from Kaiza's example. I've said this before, but in the NEL, sight is power. So we should see this as a sign of strength that Isagi now projects his gaze to serve his own needs rather than adopting another's perspective. That leads to the inevitable culmination of all this emphasis on sight. Isagi realizes that the true key to Kaiza's success is in the way he uses his eyes, in how he constantly uses his peripheral vision to track everything that happens on the playing field. But more than that, Isagi elevates this so-called Metavision into a godlike perspective that transcends the thought processes of mere mortals. But here's the really significant bit. Once Isagi ponders the implications of seeing the field from a higher dimension, he realizes that he can become a god, that he can surpass Kaiza, and even that he can beat the entire world. This is the moment where Isagi for the first time envisions himself as the world's best, and significantly this coincides with him uncovering an entirely new way to see the world. This is reinforced visually as well. Just look at how Isagi's eyes serve as the focal point of the entire spread. So, for an arc about the power of sight, this singular moment perfectly encapsulates what it means to have the vision of the world's best. In fact, the Metavision sequence deliberately recalls the moment where Isagi discovers his unique talent. Back in the first selection, Chigiri talks about Isagi's exceptional ability to monitor the entire field, like a god peering down on the realm of mortals. And just look at the visual similarity between the all-seeing deity that Chigiri imagined and the omniscient eye representing the godlike perspective of Metavision. And this segues directly into Isagi's realization that his newfound ability would turn him into a virtual god. To put it simply, this scene in the Manshine match is the moment where Isagi finally actualizes the latent potential that Chigiri had identified all that time ago, where he transforms his eyes and brain into an unrivaled weapon as they were always meant to be. So let me turn to his foil on the English team, because that's what Nagi effectively becomes over the course of the arc. As I set out earlier, Nagi has been characterized by a persistent inability to imagine and visualize. This is reinforced further by a close-up shot of Nagi's eyes when he complains that creativity exhausts him. For him, all this looking around is frankly tiring. So from that perspective, I don't think it's a coincidence at all that Isagi's first use of Metavision is to shut down Nagi's simplistic creativity. As such, it's quite telling that when Nagi asks Rail to rekindle their partnership, he leaves it to Rail to imagine what that would be like. And when the action commences, this lopsided dynamic is on full display. Rail is the one who sees dreams without end, which is reinforced by him subconsciously acquiring Metavision in this very sequence. Nagi's performance, meanwhile, reaches another level because Rail fills his mind with visualisations. All this culminates with Rail seeing exactly how he can realise his partner's dream. Nagi's ideal amounts to beating Isagi, so when Rail's last pass forces the two into direct confrontation, this situation finally puts Nagi in a position to see himself as the world's best. With the benefit of hindsight, it's easy to see that this was just a stopgap measure at best. The limits of this new approach were already flagged during Nagi's first moment of introspection after his generational goal. He's gazing at Isagi, the player he has finally surpassed, and is uncertain about the next step. This issue persists throughout the rest of the arc, however. After the match, Nagi admits he still can't imagine what the world's best would look like. So, where Isagi gained a new means to monitor the field and an accompanying vision of how to make himself the world's best, Nagi offloaded the visualizing onto Rail and concluded the match without a replicable blueprint to lead him to the top. Moving on to Yukimiya and his greatest insight of the match. Yukimiya is, as mentioned before, the figure who is blinded both figuratively and literally during the match, and that leads him to steal the ball from his teammate and go on a reckless solo charge with an infinitesimally small chance of success. But right when the tensions between himself and Isagi erupt to a breaking point, he gains a moment of clarity. In his own words, he has finally discerned Isagi's true nature. The hero of Blue Lock is simply a self-serving egomaniac cut from the same cloth as Bastard's malicious emperor. To fully understand the significance of Yukimiya's observation, I want to go on a bit of a detour to one of the most interesting tensions in the entire Manshine match: the conflict between the ego and the external perspective. When Isagi first starts using Metavision, he describes the experience as viewing himself from a higher dimension, as if he's just another game piece in the hands of a transcendent divine entity. Yet, if Isagi has truly reached a higher plane of existence, he surely fails to act accordingly. For example, just one chapter after proclaiming that he's using himself as a pawn in a grand cosmic scheme, Kaiza blocks his shot course, and instead of electing the optimal move in an unfavorable situation, Isagi made an irrational attempt to score regardless. This is not the behavior of someone who is treating himself as just one piece of a wider puzzle. His action was clearly fueled solely by a desire for personal satisfaction and validation. That brings me to a wider point, namely that trying to transcend to an objective external perspective is fundamentally incompatible with Blue Lock's overarching philosophy of egoism. That's what makes this dichotomy so interesting to me. We're reading a comic with at its central conceit that you need to be a peerless egoist to become the world's best striker. Yet, the very vision that will lead Isagi all the way to the top requires him, at least to a certain extent, to treat himself as just one among many pieces on the figurative chessboard. And I'm looking a bit ahead now, but this tension resurfaces in the PXG match as well, where Isagi again treats himself as just another object and abandons his ego to become a machine for the sake of victory. Yet, this very desire for victory concurrently forms the core of his ego. I'd go so far as to say that this is an inherent dualism to Isagi's character. It's constantly emphasized throughout the NEL that taking a bird's eye view of the playing field and making the whole more than the sum of its parts is one of its greatest assets. Yet, at the same time, Isagi remains adamant about using these talents to fulfill his own selfish desires. So, circling back now to the scene where I left off, when Isagi approaches Yukimiya in the Manshine match, he genuinely believes that he is seeing things rationally, objectively, and impersonally. Yet, in actuality, he is simply appealing to rationality as a rhetorical cudgel to subordinate his teammates for his own selfish purposes. And that's the one thing that Yukimiya, despite being blinded by his desperation, sees more clearly than our protagonist. All this talk about considering himself as a singular piece in a larger puzzle is just a facade, because in truth, he'd been treating his teammates like pawns in his own narrative. Bastard München vs Manshine City is the match about Isagi gaining the vision to become the world's best, and crucially, this unfolds as a two-stage process. The first of these involves the physical act of taking in more visual information than anyone else, and that alone puts his playmaking on par with his bitter rival. Yet, as I hope has become apparent by this point of the video, envisioning yourself as the number one involves much more than just acute sensory perception. After all, raw data isn't of much use if you don't know how to interpret it. That's why, as the second half of the process, Isagi has to start trying to understand other points of view and realize that everyone sees themselves as the protagonist of their own story. In other words, he could never actualize his ideal of viewing the world from a higher dimension if he can't even see the perspective of others. Yet, even when he rationally understands that he must consider everyone as a protagonist in their own right, Isagi's egocentric tendencies take reign until the very end of the match. Despite coming to realize that his story is just one of the infinite tales that orbit the stratosphere, he strives to subordinate everyone else to his own grand narrative. However, the ending of the Manshine match proves beautifully that such a self-serving approach to protagonism will never suffice to reach the top. No matter how ingenious the machinations of any single player might be, no individual could ever account for everything on the field. And so, Yukimiya produces the winning goal by transcending Isagi's imagination. This is the moment that truly taught Isagi how his own performance can be elevated by trusting in external points of view. And more than that, it's deeply poetic that his eyes were opened by Yukimiya in particular. If there's one thing to take away from the conflict between Isagi and Yukimiya, it's that everyone's perspective holds value, no matter how little they see. Turning now to the penultimate match of the NEL, vision is a much bigger part of BM vs Ubers than most readers seem to realize. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that it's basically as prevalent in the Ubers match as it is in Manshine. Let's start with the most overt instances of this towards its start. A notable contrast to the other matches of the NEL, Bastard is the first to dominate the field. Specifically, Isagi's first goal of the arc can be attributed to a targeted physical training regimen that allows him to use his transcendent vision to its full potential. But then, the Ubers turn the tides, and their resurgence is almost entirely credited to their own brand of visualization. Firstly, their meticulous tactics disrupt the very ability that makes Isagi such a potent threat. Through their highly coordinated presses, they deny him the time to use his eyes altogether. However, the true terror of the Ubers is unveiled moments later, when they deliberately create blind spots for the opposing goalkeeper. With ruthless efficiency, they obstruct Gagamaru's vision. Blink once, and it's too late. Enter the notorious Predator Eye, the thing that most everyone has forgotten about except for some power scalers on the internet. Its inherent symbolism makes the power dynamic crystal clear. The blinded prey is paralyzed, cowering in fear of the carnivorous beast lurking in the shadows. A beast that is always watching, ready to pounce at the slightest moment of hesitation. So basically, if the German team snags the first point through its superior individual sight, the Ubers even the playing field by denying them their vision altogether. Barcha's characterization as a predator stalking in the dark also serves as the newest iteration of the light versus darkness motif that demarcates the rivalry between Isagi and Barcha that has been ongoing since their earliest encounter. And I'll return to this later in the video, by the way. The manga also explicitly places Barcha's newfound technique on equal footing with Isagi's world-class vision. One is not necessarily better than the other, they're simply suited to different purposes. But more than that, just when Isagi believes that he can reassert the value of his Metavision, two of the opposing players reveal an aptitude for Metavision of their own. In other words, where Isagi managed to distinguish himself through his vision in the Manshine match, against the Ubers he cedes more and more ground on this exact front. All this comes to a head when the Italian master enters the field. Isagi soon finds himself not just equaled, but even severely outclassed in his ability to monitor the field. In its characterization of Snuffy, the manga draws attention to two of his complementary qualities: Snuffy's world-class eyes and brain. These are notably the exact areas in which Isagi has excelled since the earliest parts of the story. It's as if the Ubers are rubbing salt deep into his wounds when they one-up him at his own game. As has become painfully apparent, Isagi is nowhere near the level of the world's best at this stage. And making matters even worse, our protagonist can't even visualize countering the Ubers' advance. It's as if we're returning to the very start of the arc, back when Isagi couldn't envision any way to stand out. What's also interesting in this context is the one moment where Isagi did put a halt to Snuffy's playmaking. This comes from his idea to have Raichi obstruct Snuffy's field of vision and thereby prevent some of his passing options. If you think about it, that's not all too different from the way the Ubers obscured Gagamaru's vision earlier in the match. So, long story short, the Ubers match is a contest of sight, with the two teams duking it out through their mastery of the visual domain. That's what puts the back and forths of Bastard München and the Ubers on a higher level than anything that came before. The two teams are trading blow for blow in their efforts to blindside their opponents. So let's now examine the grand conclusion of this entire sequence. The crowning moment of Shoei Barcha, where he rejects Snuffy's philosophy and comes into his own as the rightful king of the Ubers. This is the resolution of the dynamic between Barcha and Snuffy, which is arguably the dramatic core of the entire match. I've touched on this in greater detail in some of my older videos, but the crux of this story arc is that the philosophy espoused by Snuffy, that you should treat football as work and that individual players should be absolved from the responsibility for their mistakes, comes from a place of deep-rooted, unresolved trauma. And as the match unfolds, it becomes apparent that Snuffy's inability to process the loss of his best friend causes him to stifle his team's prospects and prevent its greatest players from reaching their full potential. So, let's go back to the final meeting between Mick and Snuffy and see how this ties in with the overarching ideas of the NEL. At the low point of their career, Snuffy has come to the conclusion that they must start from scratch, and so he tries to make Mick come to his senses. In his own words, he's trying to open his eyes to the reality of their situation. Unwittingly, however, he's thrusting a dagger deep into his best friend's heart. For Mick, making the realistic choice means compromising on the dream that they've shared all these years. And if Snuffy refuses to see the same dream, there's nothing more to be said between the two of them. Let's talk about the significance of the visual metaphors here. Snuffy and Mick were fundamentally connected through a shared dream to become the champions in each of the top European leagues. Now, throughout Blue Lock, following your dream is consistently presented as a rather ambivalent endeavour. That's a claim I want to substantiate in a future video, but maybe not in the foreseeable future, because it'll be another stupidly long project. But especially within the narrative context of the NEL, there is a simple reason why tarrying in the realm of dreams is not the best of ideas. It's because dreams occur when your eyes are closed. And in Mick's case, his refusal to wake up and face reality leads to the most heartbreaking of outcomes. He essentially consigns himself to an eternal slumber. But on the opposite side, Snuffy too is filled with an implacable regret. After figuratively waking up, he could no longer truly see his former dream. Barcha might actually express the matter best. Snuffy has only kept playing to fulfill the dreams of his best friends, not a dream of his own. That's why he's satisfied to call it quits after realising that dream through a technicality. And I really do mean through a technicality. After all, Mick's true aspirations were always to become the king of football, which is a much more vaguely defined concept. So, in basic terms, in the downfall of Mick and Snuffy, each of them represents one half of a duality. One fails to see reality, the other their shared dream. And this is where Snuffy's relationship with Barcha comes full circle. After all, Snuffy had previously taught Barcha a better way to use his eyes. And after making this technique his own, Barcha can bring the ideas from Isagi's wildest imagination into reality. Specifically, when he's stuck in a situation where Isagi can only see two possible shot courses. However, Barcha uses his predator eye to forcefully create a third, unforeseen option that nets him a revolutionary goal. And upon seemingly transcending reality itself, Barcha finally opens Snuffy's eyes and allows his master to start dreaming once more. At this point, even Isagi has to admit that Barcha devoured everything with his supreme visualization, to the point that he can no longer even envision himself surpassing Barcha. So here's where we turn to the second major storyline of the Ubers match, the arc of Yoichi discovering his true ego. And by this point, you'll probably be shocked to hear that the concept of sight is central to his entire journey as well. Yoichi grew up with the crushing weight of his parents' expectations on his shoulders. But in particular, there's a pivotal moment in his childhood where he realizes that his parents weren't looking at him as a person, but only at his talents. And this is maybe a bit of an aside, but it's quite telling to me that this storyline unfolds in parallel to Snuffy's lessons about needing to learn to love yourself as a person before loving your talent. This belief has already been validated by a first-hand example of what happens to someone who has never been given the love they crave deep down. Anyways, Yoichi's the person who is never seen as long as he can remember, and that is strongly reflected in his outlook on life. Yoichi retreats into the realm of gaming and begins thinking of himself as a video game character, with a tragic backstory and all. Now, Blue Lock constantly depicts gaming and other digital entertainment as an act of escapism, a cheap replacement for people running away from their troubles and true desires. Yoichi's own immersion in gaming is certainly a prime example of this. Yet, there's even more symbolic currency to this pastime in his particular case. Yoichi is someone who is effectively unseen, and this results in a blurring of boundaries between reality and fiction, where he consigns himself to the role of spectator to his own life. This is also why Yoichi's first meeting with Tabito Karas was so impactful for him. Karas might have been the first person to see beyond Yoichi's talents and poke at the dissonance in his heart. So let's move to the present day storyline now. By this point in the match, Isagi can visualize how to come out on top. However, he lacks a teammate who understands his plays and can support him accordingly. This is most clearly showcased when Yukimiya makes the wrong kind of pass and allows Snuffy to intercept the ball. And the choice for Yukimiya is no coincidence in my book. This is the player with a chronic eyesight condition, and his error of judgment embodies how Bastard as a whole fails to actualize Isagi's best vision. That's of course where Yoichi enters the picture. And ironically enough, his habit of disassociating from his own life actually transforms into a major asset. I elaborated earlier on how the Manshine match involves seeing oneself from an outside perspective. And in that light, it's no wonder that this ability comes so natural to someone who treats reality as a game. So once he enters the pitch, Hiyori soon discovers his raison d'etre, his reason for being, which is again tied to his vision. He's convinced himself that he alone sees the true talents latent in Isagi and is therefore uniquely positioned to change the trajectory of football history forever. Here we get another instance of how the NEL interweaves the two meanings of having the vision of the world's best. Hiyori and Isagi share a vision of how Isagi can score, and this is underpinned by them literally seeing the field in the same way. However, there's one moment where Hiyori falters, namely when he stands on this crossroads of fate and finds himself haunted by the phantoms of his parents and Jinpachi Ego. This is something that'll become even more relevant when we reach the PXG match, but in my book it's no coincidence that Hiyori is the first to become troubled by visions of things that don't exist. After all, he averted his gaze from reality for all these years. The reason why Hiyori found himself stuck like a deer in the headlights as soon as he had to make an independent choice is because he still feels compelled to obey the expectations of others rather than following his own desires. It's the direct result of dissociating himself from the world around him to the extent that he never made any real decision of his own. So with all this, we finally cover the prerequisites to explain how the final goal of the Ubers match intersects with Isagi and Hiyori's character arcs in the NEL, in multiple ways in fact. On the most basic level, the entire Ubers match revolves around the power of sight. Predator Eye, Metavision and all that jazz. So then, in its final moments, Isagi and Hiyori transcend the rest of the field by doing the very opposite. They score without even looking at each other. They go from gazing at the physical world to visualizing the world's best and synchronizing their ideals to bring them into reality. Over the course of the match, we've gone from scoring through the power of your individual vision to swallowing up the entire field with a superior imagination to two players surpassing everyone's expectations through a shared visualization. Baro's individual visualizations may equal or even surpass those of Isagi, but Isagi can eclipse him by seeing and bringing out his teammates' true potential. This idea is presented beautifully through the use of the dark and light dichotomy that I discussed earlier. Where Baro shrouds the field in darkness, Isagi illuminates it with his light. And it's here in the Ubers match where we see how exactly Isagi lightens the world. Hiyori felt drowned by the expectations of his parents because they were directed towards him as a person. And note how he repeatedly imagines his parents as these shadowy gremlins. Isagi's expectations, on the other hand, are directed towards a tangible outcome, in this case, him scoring a goal. So, when Hiyori finally follows along in this shared purpose, we see these beams of light radiating from the ball, that being the tool that they'll use to fulfill Isagi's expectations. However, in Blue Lock's philosophy, Hiyori could never make Isagi the best by simply consigning himself to his teammates' desires. Rather, he must actualize a desire of his own that could be fulfilled concurrently with that of Isagi. And so, we get this visual of light beaming forth from Hiyori's eyes as the manifestation of his newfound desire to see the world change up close. And also presumably, him taking in the field before executing his play. This light then bursts forth from his brain and the ball. His sensory input has now transformed into a vision of the world's best and into the idea of the moves needed to pull it off. The light of Hiyori's vision is then passed over to Isagi, who pulls off a shot that completely dissipates the darkness. And thanks to that goal, Hiyori realizes that he is an insatiable egoist himself and that he simply can't quit football after such a high. So let me pull all these threads together. What is the symbolic currency of all this light imagery in the finale of the Ubers match? On one level, it of course represents Isagi surpassing Barro. Yet, in my view, that's only half of the story. On the most basic level, there's an inherent connection between light and sight. After all, you can't see in the dark. So, when Isagi's leadership lights the way for Hiyori to awaken his ego, he's effectively opening Hiyori's eyes, and this in turn allows the pair to see further than anyone on the field. That brings me to the final outing of the NEL. Now, BM vs PXG differs from the previous two matches because it focuses less on sight in the literal sense. No new eyesight techniques or anything this time around. However, that doesn't prevent the PXG match from serving as the culmination of Isagi's quest to attain the vision to make himself the world's best striker. If I'd summarize how the PXG match fits into the arc as a whole, there are two somewhat connected concepts that play a central role as Germany faces off against France: imagination and appearances. Throughout the match, we get several moments that blur the boundary between reality and fantasy, and there's also repeated emphasis on the discrepancies between a player's appearance and their true nature. In that light, it's interesting to look at Don Lorenzo's last comment after his team's loss against Bastard München. Isagi and Hiyori won by sharing an image that transcended logic, with a goal that challenges all assumptions about what kind of plays are possible in reality. This talk of transcendent logic, coupled with Ness pondering if he might have just witnessed Isagi's magic, anticipates the programmatic flashback right before the PXG match kicks off. We learn that Alexis Ness grew up in a family of scientists who vehemently reject anything that can't be explained through pure reason. So, when Ness comes to the realization that football is the magic he's been seeking, he sets out to become a player who can cast a spell over the entire world. I want to hone in on one critical element of Ness's core beliefs here: the conviction that the world abounds with fantastical, magical, and unexplainable phenomena. A conviction that arises from his deep-rooted desire to transpose the wonders of fiction into the mundane reality before him. The subsequent match then serves as a testing ground of sorts for this claim. Also, I do have to flag it here, science and reason are something I explore as the main themes of the PXG match in my dedicated match analysis video, so if you want more of that, I'd highly recommend checking that out as well. Now, I'm gonna jump forward a fair bit here, to the moment that fully breaks down the boundaries between reality and fiction, the very thing that Ness wishes to see happen. The French team reaches its full potential when its main striker, Ren Itoshi, comes to understand the true nature of his destructive impulses. As becomes apparent through his second flashback, his innermost desire is basically to reenact a scene from a cartoon that was imprinted on him during childhood. That of the ultimate monster fighting to the death against the mightiest hero. These childhood fantasies get transposed straight into his performance on the pitch all these years later, where he still imagines himself as a child smashing his toys to bits. But here's where it gets really interesting. As Rin dives headfirst towards opportunities to go out in a figurative conflagration, he starts seeing what I might call visions of the world's best. Rin envelops himself further and further into his monstrous fantasies, and like Hiyori before him, he's halted in his tracks by a spectre that represents his greatest fears and insecurities. Rin reaches the zenith of his abilities to date while, or more precisely, because his grip on reality slips away altogether. From his perspective, the field has transformed into this surreal amalgamation of childhood fantasies and teenage trauma, both of which drive him to seek out ever greater heights. In my section on the Barcha match, I extensively discussed the significance of visualization. As Lavinio teaches, your potential is only limited by the power of your imagination. The stronger your image of the world's best, the more you can impose it upon the world. Rin, in the PXG match, brings this philosophy to its logical conclusion. His visualizations are manifested so clearly that they undo the very constraints of reality. All this comes to an explosive conclusion in Rin's goal, where he essentially imposes his destructive hallucinations upon the world at large. As he rages across the pitch, he subsumes Isagi into his imagination and transforms him into the hero figure from his childhood cartoon. And that, in turn, allows him to fully envision himself as the monster he's always inspired to be. Reality has become fiction, with PXG's Star Striker asserting the legitimacy of his visions. And where Rin's fantasies reign supreme, Isagi becomes unable to imagine himself winning. Also, the manga signposts quite clearly that Rin's greatest performance to date is inherently connected to his visions as soon as he enters his destructive trance. This quasi-transformation is signalled with a shot of these pus-infested eyeballs gushing forth from his toy kaiju. From here onwards, Rin is shown surrounded by a host of deep-sea monstrosities that stand out through two gruesome features in particular: their gaping mouths and horrific eyes. It's visual shorthand to communicate that Rin's domination is fueled by his monstrous visions and pathological veracity. Also, if that still isn't enough to convince you of the centrality of sight to Rin's evolution, have a look at Rin's last attempt to destroy Isagi. He encloses his rival in a watery snare to prevent him from reaching the ball, and as the avatar of his attempt to ruin everything Isagi holds dear, we're shown a colossal, threatening hand hovering above our protagonist, with a massive eyeball at its centre. The hand, of course, recalls the depiction of Rin as Blue Lock's puppet master from the second selection. By implication, Rin's intense process of introspection allows him to regain his past talents, but now fueled by motivations that fully align with his innermost desires. He's opened his eyes to his true nature and filled with visions beyond anyone's wildest imaginations. Now, if Rin's greatest performance to date comes from him seeing things that don't exist, Isagi undergoes the exact opposite development. Let me take the Isagi scene I discussed previously as my starting point, the one where he can no longer imagine himself winning. The sequence leading up to this was initiated by Rin's violent awakening, but there was one moment in particular that truly put the nail in the coffin. When Kaisa takes a free kick, the French master Julien Loki bursts forward only after he discerns the shot's trajectory. In one of the most superhuman feats in the series, he manages to catch up to the ball regardless. And by experiencing that firsthand, Isagi comes to understand that he'll never measure up to the freaks of nature surrounding him on the pitch. Now, this moment holds much greater significance to Isagi's character arc than you might appreciate. To explain why, I need to return to two of his most pivotal experiences in the NEL. Firstly, the moment where Isagi stops Chris Prince's wobbling knuckleball. In the face of an entirely unpredictable shot course, Isagi charges in without looking at the ball, and blocks it at the most dangerous area. Isagi managed to fend off certain defeats by gambling on rationality and defending their biggest weak spots. This is the moment where Isagi truly internalizes Bastard München's philosophy of extreme rationality, figurized by how he charges forward towards the right spot without even needing to see the ball's course. Secondly, a scene we discussed already, the winning goal against the Ubers. Here again, Isagi pulls off a seemingly impossible goal by moving without even seeing Hiyori. This is what allows him to reach the finish line before anyone else can respond. And for what it's worth, the significance of this moment is also reinforced by the first goal of the PXG match. After all, the French team firmly establishes that the level of play has escalated dramatically since Bastard's last outing by having Shido replicate Isagi's previous achievements. The manga explicitly spells out that Shido and Charles came together in the exact same kind of shared visualization that previously allowed Hiyori and Isagi to embody their ultimate play. To put it simply, throughout the NEL, it is repeatedly emphasized how impressive it is to move before or without looking, with mental visualization trumping sense perception. That is, until Loki effectively invalidates every one of these previous achievements. In a way, you can say that Kaisa's unpredictable curve shot reenacts the knuckleball scenario from back in Manshine. Yet, this time around, Loki towers so highly above the other players in terms of raw talent that he has the leisure to wait until he's seen the ball's trajectory. In short, Loki's performance reveals that all of Isagi's mental calculations were merely a paltry compensation for his lackluster physical prowess. And here, it's no coincidence that the manga conspicuously plays up Isagi's moniker as adaptability genius right before Loki makes it clear as day that Isagi can't hold up a candle to him. It's now painfully apparent that Naruhaya's assessment of Isagi back in the second selection was completely misguided. So to put it simply, Isagi entered the PXG match with an incorrect assumption about who he is, only to discover that his view was entirely off the mark. And as his confrontation with Loki forces him to face cold reality, Isagi becomes unable to even imagine himself winning. Now, let me zoom out for a bit, because this moment is actually part of a wider pattern throughout the PXG match. Time and again, we're shown these discrepancies between the perception of the match's central figures and their underlying nature. So, if there's one lesson that Isagi takes away from his contest against the French team, one beyond singular concepts like the two-gun volley, ego types, or the genius-talented learner dichotomy, it's that appearances are deceiving. Let's start with the first major instance of this trope, Michael Kaiser's return to zero. As we learn over the course of the match, there's a massive gulf between Kaiser's latter-day presentation and his true self underneath. Now, this is a topic I'll almost certainly make a dedicated video about at some stage, but very briefly, from his earliest introduction, Kaiser veils himself in the language of theatre, a poignant reflection of his background as the son of an actress and a director. There's several examples I could point to, but the most overt instance is in his very introduction. Kaiser likens himself becoming the world's best striker to taking the stage as the lead actor. Blue Lock serves as an interlude before the main act, and Isagi is the buffoon who failed to steal the show. And the sequence fittingly concludes with a standing ovation from the audience. But by casting Kaiser's theatrics in the language of drama, the manga is making a very obvious point, right? After all, when you put on a show, it means that you're not showing things as they truly are. So it's no surprise that when Kaiser's standing on the team crumbles apart, he fears for his very existence, meaning for the facade he had erected for himself in his second chance at life. Kaiser gaining a semblance of humanity is specifically depicted as a disguise of sorts, covering up the terrible darkness underneath. And as the German ace finds himself on a crossroads between stagnation and rebirth, he decides to peel away the persona and face the person he is underneath head on. It's not just the man himself, however, who comes to a realization about the true nature of Bastard's superstar. If we return to the start of the NEL with the benefit of hindsight, we can witness Isagi taking on two misguided beliefs that colour his entire understanding of the German team. It's therefore highly fitting that the arc ends with him dispelling both of these to secure his spot at the top. The first is his aforementioned admiration of Noah, which prevents him from even envisioning plays that surpass his idol. The second one is a moment that I never even questioned before the finale of the PXG match. After witnessing the Kaiza impact, Isagi declares his main rival a bona fide genius, one who surpasses the very image of Isagi's ideal plays. Flash forward 100 chapters to the aftermath of Kaiza's PXG goal. Specifically, Isagi's reaction to the shot. He acknowledges his German rival as a true superstar, making him a figure on par with his hero Noel Noa. I don't have time to explain the connection here, but check out my video on what gets lost in translation for the full details. The sequence ends with one of my favourite pages in the entire manga, where Isagi and Kaiza look directly into each other's eyes and acknowledge each other as equals, as their primary rival for the status of world's best. With all this in mind, let's now return to Isagi's low point, where he can no longer see himself competing with the true geniuses. That is, until he comes to the realization that Kaiza is a talented learner like himself. So why is this the insight that changes his entire perspective on the value of players? Put simply, it's because Isagi has accepted a number of facts over the course of the match that together form a syllogism of sorts. Premise A: Kaiza is a football superstar. Premise B: Kaiza is a talented learner. Ergo, there's a path for a talented learner to become the world's best striker, one he can also pay for himself. Finally, we arrive at the last of Isagi's misguided views, the one that shackled him most of all: his belief that Noel Noa is a man worthy of his admiration. I'd go so far as to say that since the start of the arc, his adoration of Noa has been Isagi's greatest mental block. In the early stages of the arc, his reverence prevented him from even imagining plays that surpassed the likes of Noa's, to the extent that he needed to chase after an entirely different goal altogether. All this changes completely during the PXG match. Just when Isagi finds himself doubting his own abilities, Noa kicks him down even further. The Master Striker unveils that he only joined the NEL to awaken Kaiza's ego, and that this was the sole purpose for which he guided Isagi all along. Once again, our protagonist was deceived by appearances. Noa was never a gallant superhero or a kind-hearted mentor. He's more of a warped sociopath who's willing to take any means necessary to allow him to scale ever loftier peaks. That's why Isagi explicitly draws attention to Noa's hypocrisy when he rejects him for the first time. And it's exactly because he now sees through his master's lies that he can look Noa straight into the eyes and aspire to take him down. I'd be far from the first to suggest that the two spreads of Isagi facing Kaiza and Noa respectively deliberately parallel each other. Now, Blue Lock regularly creates parallels of composition to great effect, but even among copious available examples, this is one of the most conspicuous instances in the series. So, what's exactly being communicated here? As I see it, the manga is drawing attention to the parallels between Isagi's and Kaiza's developments. In both cases, the speaker has undergone a profound moment of introspection, dropped their misguided fixations, and come out with a newfound understanding of who they truly are. A piece of shit yearning for love, a talented learner who wants to win above all else. And in the aftermath, they can finally see their greatest obstacle for what they truly are. A genuine rival who will lead Kaiza to greater heights, and a self-serving schemer who abused Isagi's admiration. And after being reborn from the ashes, both can face the person who broke them down eye to eye, with their sights set firmly on the world's pinnacle. So, long story short, the finale of the PXG match has 3 consecutive instances of Isagi seeing beyond appearances and dispelling his previous assumptions about those around him and about himself. All these experiences allow him to view the world with fresh eyes. In fact, the visual shorthand of this new mindset that arose from all these insights is literally a form with puzzle pieces emanating from his eyes. And in the ultimate demonstration of his newfound mentality, Isagi surgically demolishes Loki's supreme visualization and wins a battle of vision against the French master. Once more, he faces off against Rin's rampant imagination, but now that he's seen the truth, he can freely manipulate his opponent's fantasies. If you've gotten this far into a ludicrously long video about a gay football comic, I assume that you're at least partly convinced that the concept of sight is central to the NEL's narrative framework. That the Neo Egoist League is the arc about Isagi acquiring the vision of the world's best. Over 150 chapters, he exponentially expanded the amount of visual information he takes in, learned to see the value of other people's perspectives, brought a shared visualization of the world's best into reality, and finally opened his eyes to the true nature of himself and those around him. So now at last, let's turn to the final moments of Bastard München versus Paris X Jean, the true culmination of everything that the arc has built up. I opened my discussion of the PXG match by focusing on Alexis Ness as another figure the manga aligns with fantasy rather than reality. And it's quite significant that we witness the moment Isagi scores the winning goal from his point of view. Ness finds a new source of imagination and issues his final pass as a challenge to Kaisa, as a last chance for them to start over. And for a brief moment, he witnesses his former partner charging towards the ball. But in truth, his hopes had been clouding his vision, because he soon discerns that it was Isagi running up in a perfect full circle moment. Back at the start of the NEL, Isagi saw Kaisa as the perfect embodiment of his optimal self. So, after all his trials and tribulations, he's finally turned the matter around. He was the only one who still saw Ness's full potential and truly actualized it by becoming the spitting image of the world's best. Enough at least that even Kaisa's greatest admirer can barely tell them apart. And just a final note on Kaisa. The ultimate reason why he failed to score in place of Isagi is because he let his preconceptions about Ness dim his judgment, because he failed to see Ness the person. Yet, even in the face of defeat, he refuses to acknowledge reality. Rather, he dives headfirst into his trauma-filled delusions. So here we are, the end of the video. If you stuck with me for over an hour, I really appreciate it. Do let me know your thoughts in the comments as well, because I'm sure to have missed or omitted some details here or there. I always love reading them, even if I can't respond to everything. Also, I want to thank everyone who helps me bring my own vision of the world's best into reality. In particular, I'm grateful for Gabriel Lewis's invaluable assistance with the editing, and all my patrons who help me cover my channel expenses. I especially want to thank my €10 patrons: Bunroon, Jesus Cujo, Local Sass Boy, MJ Cave 18, Melody and Orangey Legend. You're the absolute best. And until next time, Slán go fóill.